Mr. Mendocino, I'll start with you. Vice Admiral Norman today referred to the alarming and protracted bias of perceived guilt across senior levels of their government. Was there bias against Mr. Norman in the PCO or in the government?
No, there was not, and I would echo the statements that were made by Vice Admiral Norman's lawyer today, which is that this was a trial that was carried out without any political considerations impacting the outcome of this trial. Indeed, she described it as being unassailable by any political considerations, and this is indeed what Canadians would expect. We have a justice system which is world-renowned, which enjoys the confidence of Canadians because we have rules and principles in place, and today is an affirmation of that.
Ms. Hennon actually specifically said that there wasn't political interference, but she also made a point right after saying that, of saying that the government was very much present at the table, that there were 7 or 8 lawyers at all times, and she pointed out that the PCO and other departments in government made a distinct decision to litigate rather than provide documents that the defense had asked for, to litigate and essentially, she said, draw the process out for 6 months. Is that maybe not political interference, but political involvement?
No, and Ms. Hennon's a very experienced defense lawyer, and she would understand very well the defense disclosure process. I myself have participated in many trials, and these applications which were put forward involved third parties, in other words, parties outside of the traditional Crown and the defense. It involved other branches, and in the course of producing those documents, and indeed thousands of documents were produced to Vice Admiral Norman, there needs to be a careful vetting to protect national security, to protect solicitor-client privilege. If the opposition is going to say we need to uphold the rule of law, that also means those principles as well.
Mr. O'Toole, as Mr. Mendocino points out, Ms. Hennon did say that today's day shows that the system works, that there was not political interference. Would you agree?
No. Mark Norman shouldn't have required hiring the best lawyer in the country to defend him. This goes back to the first Liberal cabinet meeting where Scott Bryson tried to interfere with an ongoing naval contract. The Prime Minister's office then hired the journalists that broke the story on the leak from the cabinet meeting. Michael Wernick did an investigation, found 73 people knew about the leak, but only Mark Norman was initially charged, and he was charged a year after the Prime Minister said he would be charged. So this has been political from day one. I'm very proud that DPP made the right decision to stop or to stay the charges. But the very fact we're having this discussion, Vashi, goes back to the first days of the Trudeau government, where the old habits of the party influence trying to change things, potentially at the behest of supporters. This should concern a lot of Canadians, and the fact that a fine Canadian's name was dragged through the mud for over 2 years, it's shameful, and people are demanding answers.
But he was ultimately cleared, right? And he was done so through the justice system as it works right now. And she was unequivocal. Ms. Roussel, who our viewers will know through our discussions on SNC as the Director of Public Prosecution, was unequivocal as well. There was never political interference.
Who made the decision after Mr. Wernick told the Prime Minister there were 73 people aware of the leak? Mr. Norman was not at the cabinet meeting where the leak occurred. Why the decision to pursue him? There's a lot of questions here, Vashi, that go before there were charges laid, before the DPP got involved. They are the finest prosecutors, and they realized there was no prospect of conviction. There shouldn't even have been this scandal, but for the interference of the early Liberal Trudeau government.
Mr. Angus, your party is calling for an independent investigation. Same question to you. Ms. Hennon and Ms. Roussel say there was no political interference. What else would you like the investigation to ascertain?
Well, I think Canadians need many answers into why a career naval officer who served this country was treated in such a shabby fashion. This goes back to a Liberal cabinet meeting. What was the role of Scott Bryson? This was about a very lucrative shipbuilding contract. There's allegations that this was the political interference to help political friends of the Liberal Party. Why was Admiral Norman the only one taken out and treated in this manner? And the other element that I think, to the credit of the Director of Public Prosecution's decision not to go forward, is when you have a former Canadian general like Andrew Leslie stepping up to testify on behalf of Admiral Norman, I think that sends a real signal of his credibility. But what's staggering is that he was a star Liberal MP. So we now have Andrew Leslie who's willing to testify against the government direction, following the former Attorney General who stepped down, following the former President of the Treasury Board who stepped down. We have never, ever in Canadian history had such powerful members of a government step out over an issue of interference in the rule of law. So I think we need an independent investigation to explain to Canadians how this trial got off the ground, what was the role of the government in trying to help friends of the government in terms of getting these contracts.
Mr. Mendocino, why was Mr. Norman singled out, and would your government agree to an investigation to figure out what the reasons for that are?
Well, I begin by underlining that the decision to investigate, charge, and eventually stay the charges against Vice Admiral Norman were made by the RCMP and by the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, respectively. I know that the opposition is going to try to relitigate this in the court of public opinion, but really what they would have you do is say, don't believe Mary Hennon, who defended Vice Admiral Norman, and certainly don't believe the Director of Public Prosecution Service of Canada, believe Andrew Scheer, believe Aaron O'Toole. Well, I'm sorry, that is not the way that you... That is not the way that you, well, listen carefully to what Vice Admiral Norman's counsel said. And when you look very closely at the way that this matter was conducted, indeed, it was carried out independently. The decision to investigate, the decision to charge, the decision to stay those charges were all carried out independently. That is a fundamental hallmark
but your government
of the way
was
our
at the
court
table.
system works.
Your government was at the table. Your government had the opportunity to provide those documents at the earliest possible point to shorten the amount of time that this man had to endure what he endured, and the government didn't.
By necessity, and at all times, there were ethical walls to ensure that the prosecution was carried out responsibly and independently with due regard to the disclosure obligations of the Crown in keeping with our need to protect national security and solicitor-client privilege. Vashi, that is the way prosecutions are carried out in this country.
Mr. Mendocino, is there a cap to how much the government will reimburse Mr. Norman for his legal fees?
Well, that's a decision that was communicated today by the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan. I certainly would not want to usurp either him or his department's decision with regard to that. But I think that is indeed, again, another hallmark that what we have had here is a fair process.
So no answer on whether there's a cap or not?
Indeed, that will be a decision which will be communicated by the Minister and his department.
Mr. O'Toole, should Mr. Norman be reinstated to his former position?
Absolutely. We've called for that immediately. In fact, what's funny, Vashi, is a couple of weeks ago, the Liberals voted against covering Mark Norman's legal fees. Normally in a court finding, if you have to pay costs and the fees of the other side, it's when the court has found against you. So,
to be fair, the charges hadn't been stayed at that point, though.
The charges were not stayed, but the Liberal MPs that voted against that were supporting the actions and decisions of the Prime Minister's office. I say again, the initial investigation here was done by Clerk Michael Wernick, who is no longer working for the PMO. We saw that in the SNC scandal, or the PCO. Why was Mark Norman singled out after this investigation had 73 people? Why did they hire the CBC journalist who first broke this scandal? There's so many questions that go right to the root before the DPP and the lawyers were involved. The early decisions of the Trudeau government should concern Canadians.
What about the decisions of the RCMP? The prosecutor today was unequivocal that further evidence provided to the prosecution, some from applications for records that were not part of the investigation file, and some volunteered by the defense, are what swayed them, what convinced them to stay the charges. Are you concerned that the RCMP was not made aware of that, or didn't have that information and yet still proceeded with this investigation?
I am concerned, and I'm also concerned by the fact that we may not still have all the information, both the defense, the RCMP, because it came out at the pre-trial that they were using code words to not disclose Admiral Norman's name. He was called Kraken and other code words to hide, essentially, documents related to this case and his defense. The last
Although
time
they claim they weren't hiding it, but
why were they using those things rather than saying Admiral Mark Norman? It's similar to what Ontarians remember from the gas plant when the Liberals used code words to hide disclosure. It ended Dalton McGuinty's career. So the same people that were involved in that are here in Ottawa, Vashi, and it's been concerned.
Total dog whistle, and this is proof positive of the way that the Conservatives want to politicize the court and the criminal justice system. They bring motions onto the floor of the House of Commons. They try to get disclosure of fundamental facts in the House of Commons instead of respecting the independent court system.
And I take your point, Mr. Mendocino, but Miss Hennon, I know you're referring to Miss Hennon, and she did say there was no political interference, but she did also make sure that she pointed out the degree to which your government was involved in these proceedings, and she was not insinuating that it was free of any political involvement.
Mr.
Angus, go ahead, yeah.
They were telling the government lawyers were telling what could be said and what couldn't be said. Now, the Liberals say this is about national security and solicitor-client privilege, but this stems from what happened at Cabinet about interference in a political contract to help friends. And so...
But look, it wasn't the government who decided to go ahead with the investigation. It was the RCMP. It wasn't the government who pressed charges. It was the prosecution.
But the issue is, about getting to the bottom of this, is that we have lawyers for the Government of Canada deciding what documents will be turned over following, Mr. Wernick's investigation, deciding telling witnesses what can be said and what couldn't be said. Mr. Norman was up against the power of the state from the get-go over whether or not he actually stood up on an issue of integrity, which was about Liberals interfering in a lucrative contract. That is, to me, an unacceptable situation. So I am glad that the Director of Public Prosecutions withdrew the charges. I never had a doubt that those charges would be withdrawn, because when you watched how this case unfolded, it was clear they did not have the evidence. And having Andrew Leslie step forward, stepping down as a star
Although he
Liberal,
won't confirm anything that's being reported. He
well,
didn't
no, but
say
Charlie
it.
but
will
he's
insinuate
willing,
it.
he's willing
he's
to
leaving.
testify.
He is leaving.
Willing to testify is unprecedented, that a Liberal MP, former general, would be there with the defendant this morning to hug him and say, you were right all along. So I think Canadians can judge for themselves by that.
Okay, I'm out of time.
Well,
so
I would just say that you've seen...
Yeah,
nothing
quickly,
but-
Mr. Mendicino.
There's a lot of
Bye-bye.
insinuation
Yeah.
there that goes far further than anything that you heard from Mary Henin today,
Let's have an inquiry.
as well as the Director of
That's why
Public
we need an
Prosecution.
inquiry.
Okay,
And
I hate to
Canadians
cut the
will
party
judge
short, but
Thank you.
I have to.
Committing to an inquiry.
Thank you very much to all three of you. Thanks to Mr. Mendicino, Mr. O'Toole, and Mr. Angus.